Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host Bryan. We're going to check out a special selection to wrap today up. That's where one of you tell me exactly what it is I need to check out. You may have noticed from the title of this video that we're checking out Me Without You. Again, we literally just checked them out for the themed video for today. I figured I couldn't help myself putting both of these together on the same day. This one comes out as from Toby, a song from a post-hardcore turned alternative rock band. Me Without You, from a concept album following a group of anthropomorphized animals that escape a circus train in 1879. This song, infused with much of the songwriter's own hang-ups, in particular follows a fox and a bear having an existential conversation about God and their own pasts as they wander aimlessly through the wilderness. Alright, that is an interesting concept for a song, but it actually kind of falls in line with what I expect from Me Without You, given what we just listened to with the previous song, which, why can't I remember what that was called? Anyways, let's dive into this one, Fox's Dream of the Log Flume. Like a sonic fever dream.
Provisionally eyed, practically alive, mistook sign for signified, and so sins have often tried to run off a cliff like Gadarene swine.
See, here we have a pretty straightforward 4/4, but that intro is a bit more ambiguous.
Or maybe just better able to pretend, and what better means to our inevitable end. No, I don't know if I know, though some with certainty insist no certainty exists. Well, I'm certain enough of this. In the past 14 years, there's only one girl I've kissed. In the blistering heat of the Asbury Pier, we sat quiet as monks on the Ferris wheel. You're looking down at the Walter.
Really big bass tone at the bottom of all of this.
You're in that recurrent fantasy where you push little kids from the tops of the rise, and she shook her head no. I said, oh, neither do I. And with my grandma's ring, I went down on one knee, and the subsequent catastrophe has then haunted me like a fiberglass ghost. Out of your mind, inconveniently selective memory. Provisionally you mercifully withdrew all the bearing points we thought we knew. Days run, days set plot. Our compass shot. We sailed waywardly on, singing our midnight archer songs until well past dawn. It's still dark on the deck of our boat, haphazardly blown. Broken bows, our aimless arrow words don't mean a thing. So by now I think it's pretty obvious that there's no God, and there's definitely a God. I dreamt of the rocks at the Asbury Dune, that you jump from the top of the Log Flume, and they gather like wolves on the boardwalk below. They're howling for answers. No wolf can know. I charged at the waves with a glass in my hand. I was tossed like a ball at the bottle stand, and I landed beside your remains on the stones where your cold fingers wrapped around my ankle bones. Maybe 10 feet away was a star. Thousands of times the sun.
I'm trying to figure out this side. I think it's an acoustic and an electric guitar stack. It doesn't feel much slower, but I felt it slowing down. I don't know if it was a short retardando, maybe like 5 or 10 BPMs.
Until our chest was full of yarn we spun from Shetland wool. Socks from where the doors slid through.
The offbeat cymbal gives this a really nice forward momentum.
Hours before the rooster crows.
It's a really interesting production though. The drums are really dry.
Through this huge tailor's down the superstition well.
Nice use of a bass slide there at the end. Bow, 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 bow. Kind of allows it to wind up to tie it all up a little bit better than just having those four solid notes, having that downward bend to it as well. All right, this is interesting because I really only see two main ideas here. The first 30 minutes, the first 3 minutes, and the final 45 seconds. The first 3 minutes kind of have an A and a B to it. A little bit, there's some small variation that goes on in there, but for the most part, the guitars and drums and bass form one idea. The vocals sort of just riff on top of that. There doesn't seem to be any defined melody to the vocals. There are pitch shifts to them, dynamic qualities to it, but a melody, I don't know, we'll touch on that in a second. And we modify this a little bit here, a little bit there, but for the most part, the atmosphere doesn't change, the energy doesn't change. I can't really say that there's a verse-chorus structure, primarily because we don't ever come back to a chorus. It's fully linear. And then that takes us to the outro, which is a wildly different rhythm, a smaller atmosphere, just a different vibe altogether. We have the dual vocals in here, not aggressive like they were in the first 3 minutes, but soothing, maybe? And delicately harmonious, I think would be the word I use for that. And then the song sort of just ends with these 4 accented hits. It's interesting then, I think, that despite not being a lot of movement in this song, at least if there is, it's not dynamic enough for me to pick up on different sections of the track. But despite that, it never really gets boring. I don't know if that's because I was along for the vocal story, and I want that to be different from the lyrical story. I was not really listening to the words. There were a couple of lines I picked up, but as usual, I'm jumping around between a bunch of different instruments. I don't know what was being told as a story lyrically, outside of, the description of the song from the requester. But the delivery of the words, the intensity shifts in that, how we started out a bit more conversational, and the energy and passion rose throughout the 3 minutes of the A section, finalizing on some vocal cracking, something along the lines of, I guess it was a fry scream, right? But kind of like that area between aggressive singing and Fry screaming, somewhere in the middle of those two, almost like cracking between the two of them, like where your voice cracks into your head voice. And kind of finding like that awkward middle in between. That's what the vocals reminded me of there. And it was a journey to get from one to the other. Not narratively, at least not through words, but a narrative through sound. Listening to the vocals become faster and louder and more aggressive, more punctuating. We don't really hear too much of that in the rest of the instrumentation, though. I think the vocals really drive that forward momentum. The rest of the instruments, they present atmosphere. We have a bass really filling out the low end at the bottom, not really doing anything too exciting, kind of holding out some notes, and then maybe a passing tone into the next note that's going to be held out, but it is a big tone. It takes up a lot of room. It really fills out the low ends. And then we have 3 or 4 guitars. I'm still not entirely sure on this. The left side in particular, I'm the most confused about. There is an electronic sound that I tend to hear the pitch of. In the same rhythm that those pitches are being played, I can hear acoustic guitar strumming. Not really a pitch to it, just the texture of strumming an acoustic guitar. It makes me think that there is an electric and acoustic guitar being played and positioned over there. But I don't really hear that same balance on the other side, except occasionally I do hear a fourth instrument. I'm not sure what it is. Maybe it is just another acoustic guitar. It's definitely a more percussive sound, though, more than electric guitars tend to be, which are more of a softer texture as far as attack goes. They might have a harsher sound overall. Some electric guitars I've described as a buzzsaw sound, but that's usually the sonic characteristic of what's held out, the note itself, more so than the attack, the initial sound that's used to create the music. So like I said, I don't know, 3-4 instruments maybe between the two sides. What's interesting is that the instruments on a side are doing the same thing. The acoustic and electric guitar over here are playing the same rhythm, the same notes, but they're playing something very different from what's being played over here. Sometimes it's just harmonizing on the same rhythm. They're just at two different pitches. They move with each other. Other times it's two completely different ideas. This is something that we saw earlier with the other Me Without You track. Was a lot of split guitar work. And we see a lot of the same things here too, where sometimes it's used for a positive effect, where both sides are amplifying a single idea, not just harmoniously creating consonant harmony, but also just having two completely different ideas that support each other. There's no dissonant sounds, there's no playing over each other. They fill in each other's space and they embellish what the other one is doing. They're unique and interesting lines on their own, but they really shine when they're played together, like taking multiple puzzle pieces and forming a full picture out of them. They sort of dance between the two of these, though. Some are more harmonious and complementary, and some are less complementary, more negatively layered, where they do kind of clash a bit. Mostly harmonically. I don't think there's any places where I think that there's just too much sound going on, or that they're playing too similar of ideas, that they start to overlap and muddy up the sounds. I think most of the time it's just a sort of a light dissonant harmony. And then that takes us to the drums, which they give us some interesting ideas rhythmically. And the drums do tend to line up with some of the rhythms of the vocals. We're going to touch on that in a second. But other than that, the drums tend to be pretty standard. Keeping a beat in the background, sometimes putting a little bit of embellishment on it, but nothing like what we checked out earlier. I gotta look up what this song was. Me Without... Oh, Porcupine. That's what it was that we checked out earlier today. And now I remember what that song was about. But yeah, so the drumming here is a little less in the spotlight, which I think makes sense given the vocal focus and all of the instruments off to the sides that are giving so much sonic information as well. The drums, much like the bass, are there to be the glue that holds all of these more disparate parts together and allows the song to feel like a cohesive whole. It's the one thing that kind of says, all right, everyone, we're a song, we need to work together here. And all of this takes me to the vocals. And I mentioned that they're very linear. There's not really a melodic element to them. That isn't to say that there isn't melody. I think that you could map or transpose the vocal line into sheet music, and I think you would find something melodic to that. In fact, later on in the song we even have harmony, so there is a melodic quality here, but I don't think it's the main purpose of it because it doesn't sound like typical singing, and I think most of you probably felt that too. It feels more like speech in a lot of ways, a bit sing-songy sort of, but I think it mostly has to do with rhythmic delivery. It feels more like a poem being read with music behind it, more so than singing words with music. To me, there's a bit of a separation between what the vocals are doing and what the music is doing. However, there are times where they sort of overlap. There's one moment where the vocals, which were moving at a pretty quick pace, decided to make these 4 syllables have immense impact. And they shifted to an offbeat accent pattern that sort of disrupted all of the groove that we had already built up, and to do something quite a bit different that was rhythmically jarring. If they had just done this by themselves, it would have been seen as a type of rhythmic counterpoint, maybe a polyrhythm, but instead everybody joins in on it. The guitars, the drums, the bass, everybody plays this rigid rhythmic pattern. And it puts real strong emphasis on these 4 syllables. Maybe it makes sense knowing what was said there for those words to have emphasis, but without that it feels kind of random. But it is one of the few places where the vocals tend to line up with the instruments and they do something collectively. Like I said, all the other times there's a wall between them. The vocals feel more like spoken poetry. And I find it to be interesting because there is growth, there's dynamic qualities to the vocals. Some of them are a bit quieter, some of them are a bit louder. As we go through the passage, we increase intensity, we begin to attack some of these syllables a little bit more harshly. And by the end of it, like I said, we've increased the volume to a point that the vocals have cracked into a fry scream for specific syllables. I don't know any other way to describe that. It feels like spoken word poetry, but there's a musical component to it. And I know I've heard stuff like this, and in fact, I might even say that this reminds me of La Dispute. But I feel like La Dispute, they aim for a little bit more musicality in their speech. This one aims a little bit more towards the poetry. It fits rhythmically, sure, but it's not quite as synced with the music. And I find that to be really interesting because there is still a dividing line, I think, between this and like Def Jam poetry, where there is a musical component, maybe some drums or something played but behind the poet, but it's usually more of an atmospheric thing, completely divorced from the poetry itself, whereas here there is still some linkage between the poetry and the music. It's really interesting because to me there's usually been more of a black or white situation. Is it singing or is it spoken word? But the more that I think about it and the more that I've heard stuff like this and kind of comparing it to other types of music and spoken word poetry outside of a musical context, I begin to see more of a sliding scale element to it. I don't think it's quite a full gradient spectrum, but it's definitely more nuanced than I originally thought it could be. And that's something that I enjoy about this song. And maybe not something about it in particular, but it's made me think about this stuff. And it's always a good thing for me. Aside from that, we have the ending. Like I said, there's the nice vocal harmony there, and it's a very stripped down version of what we listened to. I don't really have much to say about that. Maybe the lyrics would explain why we take things down a notch, but I think the last thing I want to bring up is the production on this. I think the guitars, bass, and vocals are all produced well for this sort of indie rock feeling, but those drums are a bit awkward. They're very dry. They're very compressed. It sounds like they were recorded with low quality mics. I know from experience. And they end up kind of lacking punch. They're a little muddy, a little fuzzy, but kind of thin also. It's an interesting decision given the full range of sound that every other instrument is allowed to have in its production. I don't think it ever ends up feeling out of place, but it is something I immediately noticed as something that you just don't hear too often. I think outside of lo-fi black metal, the drums are usually the thing that gets the production touch-ups, even if nothing else does. We've listened to some independent folk that's had some really rough guitar work, some fuzzy, muddy bass work, some very underproduced vocals that seems to be pretty common, but very rarely are the drums left unproduced. And I just found that to be really interesting. I noticed it at the beginning, but it wasn't as apparent, I think, because there's so many other layers going on and the drums are sort of just there in the background. But at the end of the song, the drums take up a lot of the sound sphere just because there's not much else to listen to. And it's just very apparent how, again, underproduced, I think is the best word for it, the drums are. I'm going to take a second to read some lyrics and then we're going to wrap this video up. And I'm quite a bit lost with these lyrics. It starts off with Fox waxing poetically about something. The language is a bit too obtuse for me to dig into. It says, provisionally, I, practically alive, mistook signs for signified, and so since I've often tried to run them off a cliff like Gadarene swine, and tied my word ropes and anchor bends, wondering whether we were someone better than, or maybe just better able to pretend, and what better means to our inevitable end. I've read this stanza half a dozen times, and I am no closer understanding what Fox is talking about right here. Now, Bear jumps in at this point, and I love the flow of this stanza. Just the way that there's this, it's not even like, I mean, it is interline rhyming, but there's just a rapid consistency of a specific syllable. It says, no, I don't know if I know, though some with certainty insist no certainty exists. Well, I'm certain enough of this in the past 14 years there's only one girl I've kissed. There's just, it's linguistically strong. It also calls into question, though, what it means to be certain, what it means to exist. It leads me to believe that this song is, well, actually, I know it is. It's Fox and Bear having a philosophical conversation about the existence of life and God and what any of this is supposed to mean. Bear says, though, that he's certain that in the past 14 years he's only kissed one girl, though, and then he goes into a memory. Being at Asbury Pier, dead quiet, on a Ferris wheel with presumably somebody that he loves, and decides to propose. And it is a catastrophe that has haunted them. As I quote, haunted me like a fiberglass ghost in the attic. That's a very interesting description of a ghost, to metaphorically describe it as fiberglass. The next stanza starts off, my inconveniently selective memory as provisionally you mercifully withdrew all the bearing points we thought we knew. I don't know, man. The language in this song sometimes goes right over my head. But I do believe inconveniently selective memory is, he says, as you mercifully withdrew. I think it's about not having a choice about what you remember, and sometimes you tend to stick with the worst moments of your life. You just can't forget about them. Your brain decides that they're big enough to remember. From here, though, Bear seems to be talking to Fox not about this event, but about life again. He says, we sailed waywardly on, singing our midnight archer songs until well past dawn. It's still dark in the deck of our boat, haphazardly blown broken bows. Our aimless arrow words don't mean a thing. I think he's just saying that we may be talking profoundly in some way, but honestly we're saying nothing. And a very obtuse way, using a lot of words to say that they're actually saying nothing with what they're saying. He ends it though, he says, it's pretty obvious that there's no God, and there's definitely a God. And I find this to be an interesting competing statement. both of those can't be true, but they can be, right? Because we don't know. Honestly, religion kind of creates Schrodinger's God. If you believe there's a God, then there is one. If you don't, there isn't, and there's no proof to say one way or the other. And I wonder if that's what they're trying to say with this statement, which is interesting given O Porcupine, which was about a character that was very much convinced that there's a God. What I find interesting next, I don't really understand the last few stanzas here. They get quite existential, I believe. They refer to themselves as parts of carnival midway attractions. Use the baseball bat to knock over the milk jugs, and use darts to pop balloons and stuff like this. And he says that we're tossed around like balls at the bottle stand, and um, there's exploding tiny balloons and darts being thrown at them. I'm not really sure what all of this means. Um, but the interesting thing is that the harmonized vocals here aren't from within the band. It's a featured artist, Hayley Williams of Paramore fame. That's pretty cool. I would never have expected that. Um, After the allusions to the Midway Games, though, it says, I slept until our chest was full of yarn we spun from Shetland wool, in socks from where the Dorset grows, sheared and scoured hours before the rooster crows. The price of German silver fell through this disgust thalers down the superstition well. Again, I have no idea, dude. I need a little bit more direct language. But I do find it interesting, especially since with O Porcupine, the language was a bit more sophisticated, but also very clearly spoken. At least I felt. I didn't have any problem trying to read between the vocabulary to find what was being said, but maybe it is because this song is about two anthropomorphized animals waxing poetically about the profundity of life and existence and God. And because they are speaking like this, the vocalist decided to write the words like this as well, in a way that thematically it lines up with the characters. I don't know if that's what's going on. Maybe this comes from a different album from O Porcupine, so maybe the vocalist, the lyricist, picked up a thesaurus between those times and improved their own vocabulary and wanted to show it off. I don't know. I'm a bit lost here. Tying this back to the music, I have absolutely nothing here. Parts of the music, I just want to say, hey, that's indie post-hardcore. It's just things that you would expect to hear in indie rock and post-hardcore music. And honestly, this feels more post-hardcore than O Porcupine did, just with an indie lens thrown on it. The production's very indie rock. But the dual guitar work, the constant moving between the two, this is stuff that you hear in Mars Volta. This is stuff that you hear in Hail the Sun. What's that other big one? Dance Gavin Dance. Even though they've kind of moved away from post-hardcore, you'll still see that in their works. So, yeah, maybe there isn't a point trying to find any thematic ties between the lyrics and music. Maybe they just exist separately as they sort of sound like they do with the distance of the vocalist from the rest of the band. Those are my thoughts. Me Without You, Fox's Dream of Log Flume. Of the Log Flume. What do you think of this track, though? Is there anything that stood out to you? Anything that you would like to add on to what I said or correct me on? Maybe you just have your own thoughts and opinions about this track. Let me know. Put all that stuff down in the comments section. Above the comments in the description box, you'll find a link to Linktree. It takes you here. You can find links to my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all three of those. Alright, that wraps it up for today. I'll be back tomorrow, though, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 10 p.m. UTC as usual. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you choose to watch my videos.